Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Rada Madrigal, and I'll be taking you through today's session. I am joined virtually by some of my colleagues who may speak up during Q&A or to provide clarity when needed as we discuss this topic. We're here today to talk about the changes being implemented as part of the Central Procurement Entity implementation. In an effort to increase transparency and provide greater service to our stakeholders, we are recording this webinar. It will be posted on our website so that you can review it in the future, and for those who were not able to join today's call. These slides are posted on CISA.com and can be found on the release planning page under the Fall 2022 Initiative section titled Central Procurement Entity Implementation. Later today, they will also show up on the Policy Initiatives page, and either late this afternoon or early tomorrow morning, both the video recording and presentation will be available on the ISO's Learning Center. I will also add the video to the release planning page and the policy initiatives page as well, so that you'll have it accessible in whatever place you typically look. Some housekeeping notes for you today. If you can keep yourself muted to minimize background noise. If you have a question, if you would like to ask it in the chat, please make sure that you address your question to everyone so that everyone can see what you're asking. I've got Cynthia Hinman who's going to be helping me produce today's call, so she'll be helping me keep track of what is written in the chat. You also have the ability to raise your hand using the WebEx interactivity tools if you would like to ask a verbal question. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So this training, we're going to take it from the angle of first going over a high-level review of changes, and then we'll get into the application-specific details and close out the discussion talking about market simulation activities. So here's a look at the high-level objectives that we'll be covering today. For the Central Procurement Entity implementation, first of all, we'll discuss the recognition of the Central Procurement Entity itself. We'll discuss the system and local obligations for CPEs and load-serving entities with load in multiple transmission access charge areas. We'll also discuss the allocation of both system and flexible attributes of local resource adequacy resources, and talk about or clarify how the Capacity Procurement Mechanism process and cost allocations are affected in regards to these changes that we are implementing with the CPE program. Here are a couple of acronyms for you that you can take a look at, or when you're reviewing this material later, you'll have it here for reference. And now we'll dive directly into the material. To set expectations, I had initially scheduled this training to last for an hour and a half, but I believe that it will end shorter than that. There are about 30 slides to go over, and it's pretty straightforward, but I have definitely left ample time for questions. So when we review the background of the Central Procurement Entity implementation, I'm actually going to go through the slides for that portion in totality so that you have the full picture of everything that we're doing, and then you'll have the ability to ask questions once we get an idea of the framework that's being implemented. So I'll take a question break after the high-level discussion, and then I'll have a section for questions after we go through the application-specific details as well. First of all, with regard to timeline, we filed this tariff amendment with FERC on April 8th and received approval from them on July 1st. The market simulation for this initiative is kicking off next week on September 19th and will run through the end of the month. For production activation, master file and CIRA changes are going to be available in production on October 13th in preparation for the 2023 RA year. And the rest of these changes are going to be, or they have an effective date of January 1st, 2023. So we're opening this up early for the annual showing process, but this is effective for the 2023 RA year. So taking you through a high-level review of the changes, first, we're going to discuss the recognition of the central procurement entity. And to add some context and background to this initiative, in June of 2020, the CPUC ordered the creation of a central procurement entity to lead procurement of local RA resources for CPUC jurisdictional load-serving entities in both the Southern California Edison and PG&E TAC areas. Under that order, the CPUC would now assign the local RA obligation to the CPE to procure local resources on behalf of those CPUC jurisdictional LSCs in those TAC areas. Now, I wanted to mention that while the ISO is implementing this initiative to facilitate the CPUC's creation of a central procurement entity, the framework that we're putting into place would allow for other local regulatory authorities to also come up with this CPE construct where they would be able to allocate that RA obligation and have those CPEs procure local resources on behalf of their load-serving entities as well. So while we're building this as a result of the CPUC order, it will be constructed in such a way that it could apply to all local regulatory authorities as well. The central procurement entity has an obligation to procure local capacity area resources and, through a scheduling coordinator, demonstrate that procurement to the ISO through the RA showings process. Now, I wanted to note here the emphasis on local capacity because this does not include procurement of system or flexible capacity by a CPE. Now, when assigned a local obligation by a local regulatory authority, the CPE will be responsible for submitting annual and monthly resource adequacy plans to the ISO following our existing RA plan submission timeline and using the CIRA application to facilitate this process. The CPE will be subject to penalties for late or missing submissions if that were to occur, just like everyone else. I had mentioned system and flexible attributes of local RA resources. So the ISO will accept and validate both the system and flexible CPE RA credits, which are similar to the cost allocation mechanism credits, during the cross-validation process, which takes place in CIRA. Now, a point of clarification to make here, while the CPEs do not procure flex capacity, you may recall in the previous slide I said they only procure local, some of that local capacity may already have flex capability, and that will show up in the CPE RA credit data that is provided to the ISO by the CPUC. In this way, the local and flex RA that appears on these RA credit reports can actually be counted toward the LSE flex obligation through this RA credit mechanism. So this allows LSEs to benefit from local RA procurement through a CPE. Now, the CPUC adopted what it referred to as a hybrid procurement model in which LSEs could procure local resources voluntarily to meet their system and flexible RA requirements, and in which case the local resource also would count toward the collective local RA requirement of the CPE. Now, the way these CPE credits are going to be implemented, they will actually show up as negative credits for CPE so that they are not double counted towards the overall ISO system credit. These negative credits will be visible on reports within CIRA, and I'll show you what that looks like when we get to the application-specific details section of the presentation when we're looking at those CIRA reports. The central procurement entity is also subject to the ISO's existing capacity procurement mechanism process and the cost allocation methodology that goes along with that for any identified local RA deficiencies if they have not procured enough local RA. Now, I wanted to point out that because the CPE has no load, the only CPM scenarios that would apply to them are the year end and the month, or I'm sorry, the year ahead and the month ahead local deficiency CPMs. So there may be CPMs in other categories, but for a CPE, the only CPM scenarios that apply to them are these two. And therefore, the settlements costs will be allocated to CPEs in addition to individual LSEs in each TAC area for those associated CPMs were they to occur. Now, along with the implementation of a CPE, this initiative also includes a capping mechanism where entities that have load in multiple TAC areas will have their local obligation capped at the system obligation in each TAC area in the RA month ahead showings. So a CPE serves a procurement function, not a load serving function. And because a CPE will not serve load, they are exempt from the ISO's tariff and settlement provisions that are based on this load share ratio. And with that, like I stated, we had a pretty quick overview of everything that was included in this implementation. And so now I wanted to take a question break and see if anybody has any questions over what we've gone over so far before we dive into the application-specific changes. So you're welcome to either raise your hand and ask a verbal question or put any questions in the chat.
I do not see any hands raised, and there are no questions in the chat yet.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. Well, let's dive into the resource-specific details then. We're going to take a look at the changes coming in a master file process. We'll look at CIRA, and we'll look at settlements impacts. With regard to creating a new central procurement entity, the CPE must first obtain the services of a certified scheduling coordinator. The scheduling coordinator will request a new SCID in order to represent the CPE and indicate which CPE we are assigning to that ID. And then that new SCID gets approved for setup in master file, and the CPE ID is created and assigned for the CPE to be associated to the new SCID. So the ID for the central procurement entity and the scheduling coordinator get linked. We have a team that handles this creation and setup, and that is screquests@CISO.com. You can contact them to set this up, or if you have any questions about how it works. Now, once you have those IDs set up in master file for the CPE, the next step in order to gain access to the functionality for the CPE in the CIRA application is for your user access administrator to use the AIM tool to provision access to that CPE ID within CIRA. Now, there's some timing points that I wanted to share with you on that. So beginning the 12th of this month, so just this week, you were able to submit requests to MapStage for Market Sim access in order to view these CIRA changes. And then beginning on October 3rd, you'll be able to submit requests for provisioning access to CIRA in production in order to get this going for Go Live. And then within CIRA, the scheduling coordinator for the CPE will be in charge of uploading those annual and monthly RA plans and then viewing any associated reports that go along with that. Speaking of CIRA, I wanted to point out that there is new CPE data that will be available in CIRA on various reports and other screens that you look at. Here are some examples And part of the market simulation efforts are for you to view both the flexible obligation and the generic obligation report. So you will see that they have added CPE columns to these reports in CIRA. And you'll also see similar changes on other reports within CIRA, such as the cross-validation output details screen and the RA reports. I didn't add those here. It's essentially adding another column just like this for CPE. I also wanted to note for you that the CPE ID, because we are implementing this central procurement entity exactly like a load serving entity from a functionality perspective, you will find those CPE IDs in the pull downs for the LSE ID fields within CIRA, because we're essentially treating the CPE the same as an LSE. So that's where you'll find those IDs. Another thing I wanted to mention is that we have both the Flex credit template and the peak demand credit template. These are templates that are used by the CPUC to provide data to the ISO, and you can see here that new CPE columns have been added here as well. And I also wanted to point out for you, I mentioned that the CPE credits were going to show up on these reports as a negative number so that they net to 0 for the CPE area, so that overall we're not going to be double counting this capacity toward the overall ISO system capacity. So for example, if we take a look over here at the Flex credit template, in the very top row on the far right, CPE, there are 2 LSEs, row 2 and 3, that are assigned to the CPE that's titled CPE ABC. And if you add up the total of, for example, the category 1 for CPE ABC, you'll see that row 2 and 3 add up to 4774, and you can see that that gets essentially zeroed out by showing the CPE ABC has a negative credit of the same number. And you can see it corresponds similarly with the CPE XYZ that we've allocated to rows 4 and 5 as well. And you'll see that reflected across category 1, 2, and 3 in all of the columns. And that is the same that you'll see over here on the peak demand credits template as well. So you'll see how those credits are shown, but then zeroed out. And then finally, with regard to settlements changes, as I stated previously, if the CPE is short local capacity, the ISO may allocate capacity through the Capacity Procurement Mechanism. And if this occurs, this will show up in charge code 7896 on your settlement statement. Now, I did want to point out that while this charge code is titled monthly CPM allocation, there isn't actually a separate charge code for the annual process, because the annual local deficiency CPM is also processed monthly within this same charge code by providing 12 months of data to manage the process. So you'll see all of that, whether it's the annual or the monthly, you'll see that appear in charge code 7896. And that is the end of the application-specific details. So I wanted to take another question break here to see if anybody had any questions about this portion. Feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat.
I am not seeing any hands raised yet, and there aren't any comments in the chat yet either.
Okay, so now we'll talk about market simulation. The major, or the whole entire market sim started early August, and so the deadline that's posted for registering to participate in Market Sim was August 12th, but the Market Sim for this particular initiative is not kicking off until next week on the 19th. So if you wanted to participate and you still haven't requested to do so, I would ask that you submit a request now to marketsim@CISA.com. and you'll be contacted with clarification that you'll be participating and any questions that they want to ask you, but you still have time to get in if you haven't done so yet. You need to confirm that your users are provisioned for access to participate. As I mentioned, at the beginning of this week is when you could begin provisioning access to CIRA in the map stage environment. So in order to participate in Market Sim, you have to be provisioned access to CIRA. So you need to make sure that that is set up because this is new functionality for those CPE IDs that have been put in place. And then with regard to Market Sim, we've got calls Monday and Thursday of each week at 2 o'clock. And we request that you, or we suggest that you attend the market simulation calls to keep apprised of the timing of these activities, not only for this initiative, but other fall 2022 initiatives as well. For this specific initiative, there are 3 scenarios that we'll be going through in Market Sim. The first one, the goal of this is for the CPE entity should be able to view what their RA obligation data is and to be able to submit those RA showings and view any deficiencies on those reports. So you will be submitting RA plans under those CPE IDs and ensure also that your suppliers are submitting the corresponding supply plans. And then what we expect you to be able to do is verify that data by looking at the various screens inside of CIRA. So the cross-validation output details screen, the generic obligation and the flexible obligation report, and also the RA obligation report. So all of the data should flow through the normal channels and be available on those screens for the CPE. In the second scenario, we're going to allocate a CPE and cost to the CPE entities. So you don't need to do anything in this case, but we're going to have this functionality activated so that you'll be able to see and validate this cost allocation on your settlement statements in that charge code 7896 that we mentioned earlier. And then finally, there's updated logic for the load serving entities to display the system obligation and the LSE credit after any deficiency calculation. So you'll be submitting your RA plans and having suppliers submit their corresponding supply plans and making sure or taking a look to see if there are any deficiencies and what that looks like on the reports that you use normally for this. So the cross-validation output, and then the generic and the flex obligation reports. So with that discussion of Market Sim, before we close the call, like I said, it was going to be pretty quick, I anticipated. Does anybody have any final questions before we close this session?
Hi, Retta. This is Chen from PG&E. Can you go back to scenario 2? I just have a question there.
Absolutely.
So over here says ISO action is identify the resource and designate CPM and allocate a cost for this resource. Will market participants know which resource ISO is going to designate or identify and then designate the CPM cost? Is it a coordination needed between the CAISO and the market participant?
Trang, maybe you'd be able to help me with this one. I imagine that there are certain resources that maybe get identified as ones that are going to be participating in Market Sim. Do you have any further clarity on how this particular scenario will work?
Hi, Rada. Unfortunately, I don't have that detail, but I have taken a note to follow up with the SMEs and then see if we can add that to the presentation in the next market simulation call for tomorrow as we walk through and prepare for next week.
Okay, thank you, Trang. So Chen-Yu, if you can dial into the Market Sim call tomorrow, hopefully we'll be able to give you some clarity on how that one is exactly going to work.
Thank you, Rada. Thank you, Trang.
We do have a question in the chat, Radha, and it's from Tasha Salisbury. And she asks, can you please share the email to contact in order to be added to the Market Sim? Thank you.
Absolutely, Tasha. So here I've reversed the slides back to this page here. So it's marketsim@CISO.com. That's the email address that you're going to want to send a note to in order to participate in the Market Sim. Any further questions?
If you have a question, please raise your hand or put your question in the chat. Radha, I don't see any hands raised and no additional questions.
All right, well, that was short and sweet, and I'll give you some time back in your day. If you have any questions on anything presented here today, you can email them to customerreadiness@CISO.com. At the end of this presentation that's posted, you'll see that I have a reference section with links to the business requirements document, the FERC filings, the Market Sim scenarios, the initiatives page. So those are there for your reference if you need them. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you very much for your participation. We hope that you found it useful and informative, and we hope you have a great day. Thank you.